I am Yamato Cannon, and this is Muffin, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is going to be Atlus, who is obviously most well known as one of the primary commentators for the LCK, the Korean League of Legends Premier League. Right, I actually want to start Atlus. Normally, I'm not. People will know I'm really not a fan of like the mainstream style of sort of like. So, how'd you get into gaming and esports? Like, I think that's just a bit of a played out question usually. But in your case, I actually am not that familiar with the beginning of your casting career, though. Like, spoiler, I didn't watch the OPL or the Oceanic League. I'm like, obviously, you're from Australia. I have no connection to that. So I knew like roughly that you were around that area. I knew when you came onto the LPL in the early days, but I don't really know what your story is. So like, how did you initially become like a tier 1, tier 2 caster in League of Legends?
Well, it's a relatively long story because I started about as low as you could get. I remember it was 2012 that I did my very first casting audition, and that was sort of out of nowhere. It was just a friend of mine at the time like said that they were doing a casting audition. I'm like, what, you can do those? That's crazy. And it was for a New Zealand company that was just running like random tournament, which was off this it was a ladder called the Cyber Gamer Ladder in 2012. It was extraordinarily old, and that was how you played competitive League in Australia at the time. This was before we even had a server. I'm pretty sure that came in 2013. Pretty sure anyway. I remember the servers came in right in the middle of my first year commentating. So they said that they were doing this tryout, and I'm like, oh crap! All right, it sounds like a really cool gig. I might give that a shot, and I did, and I got a few gigs, and it was a bit of fun. And then I realized I didn't really want to work for this random organization that was just not really very well organized. And doing very much of anything at all. So I just decided to start grabbing random games, and I got a friend of mine, his name was Dale Never Fails, but changed his name for casting to Hot Soggy Noodles. And I was Slappy Baggins back then, so we were the Slappy Noodles, and we'd commentate random Australian games together. We got a few LAN gigs, which was really fun. There was one that we got in the end of 2012, just at a university. A bunch of people came, there were a few teams. And that was a whole lot of fun. And then I found out that Riot was moving to Australia and actually opening servers, and they were going to have an office and all that sort of stuff. So I said, all right, well, I like this as a potential job. Let's just move to Sydney. I lived in Melbourne at the time, so just moved up the peninsula, up the coast a little bit. Lived with a friend of mine for a little while, and thankfully, because I was in the right place at the right time, managed to get a tryout for Riot, and that's basically all she wrote. Because from then, we had like a seasonal system back then, so we did autumn, winter, and summer, or autumn, winter, and finals, I think is what it was called in 2013, 2014, something like that. And yeah. From that point on, I think Jat watched one of our casts, and he brought Spawn and I, who I started casting with at the beginning of that year.
The guy who's the new TL coach, if people don't know.
Yeah. He used to cast the LPL with us for quite some time before he moved into coaching. Yeah. We almost sniped him for the LCK as well, but it just didn't.
A question I did have about, by the way, it would have been perfect for that. A question I did have about the OPL is, even though obviously Oceanic League of Legends has never been a big thing on like the world stage and stuff, like you set it up there, what people probably don't know though is at one point in time it did have a fairly professional actual like esports infrastructure like you're talking about. Like the reason why at one point people like, I think even Thorin lived in Australia to do it, right? Yep. To do the LPL, that was remote from Australia, believe it or not, even when it was the LPL. So I assume when you did the OPL, you like you say, you had a studio and camera. You're not just at home on a like the old PapaSmithy VODs where he's like just in his bedroom, whatever. You're actually in like a proper setup with producers and everything, right?
Yeah. No, we had the whole thing, and there was a plethora of commentators that we had. We had, like you mentioned, Froskerin, but it was of course like Pastry and Papa were there in 2015. They stepped out for 2014, which is how I ever got the job, right? Because if Pastry was there, obviously he'd be doing all of the work. But I think he was focusing on other things for that particular year. Then he came back for 2015 because that's when we needed all these people for the LPL to start off, because there was just way too much work, right? Like in 2015, there weren't as many teams as there are now, but they did so many days. It was just absurd. I remember we had like a fridge at the office in Piermont in in Sydney, and it would just be full of these like overnight meals that we'd have to like heat up halfway through a broadcast before we went into the next best of 3. And there were often like 3 a night and things like this. And we'd have to try and work out where we were supposed to go and get dinner at 3 a.m. after the cast ended, because the time zone's okay for Australia, Australia versus China, but it's not the greatest. You know, there's still a few hours in that. So we were ending nights extraordinarily late. And it was good for the traffic, but otherwise it was really brutal. So we needed as many people as possible. To name a few more, Pulse came over. We had Fish turn up as well, who's now working behind the scenes for a bunch of Valorant and other stuff in Singapore now, which is pretty cool. A lot of guys made their way through, and I feel like it was a really good place to earn your stripes, because there was just so much work. You got so much practice. And a lot of the times at the beginning of casting, you have to do a lot of practice, like a lot of practice work, because the only way that you get better is by doing it more and more and more. And the LPL was perfect for that, because there were hours upon hours upon hours of games that you could commentate. So we're pretty lucky with the fact that we could offer people a fair bit of work if they were actually willing to come over here or over there.
Are you someone where did you actually have like an ego as a caster in this era? Did you think like, I'm good or I've got a talent? Were you one of those people where like you had to do enough work to feel like you've earned it? What were you like back then?
So it's there was actually the moment that broke. I think every commentator gets it, right? Everyone that's ever been on a stage, especially at the very beginning, is like, oh man, I'm really good at this. Don't you worry, everyone. I'm going to crush it. Like, move out of my way. I am coming through, and I'm going to be the best. And mine happened in 2013. It was a random gig that we were doing, and it was Papa that put me in my place, man. Like, Chris he sat me down, and he's like, Max, I know I've known you for a while. You're an all right guy, but you're not that good yet. Just sit back. You'll get your time once you've done enough work. Please stop being an arrogant piece of shit. And I'm so glad that happened that early on in my career, because that moment has stuck with me until now. And that was 10 years ago. Like, I think every commentator needs that humbling moment, because so much of what gets you into this gig is the ego drive, right? Is I want to be on camera. I want everyone to hear my voice. I'm good at this. This is great. This is going to be my thing. But you really need to be able to sit back and let other people talk, because you're never the only one. So it was a very important lesson to learn. And I don't even know whether Papa was trying to teach me a lesson. He was probably just trying to tell me to shut the hell up. But it gave me it did a world of good, tell you that much.
I know in League, to some degree, because of the nature of the broadcast, it's not as structured as like Counter-Strike, for example. To some degree, every caster does a bit of analysis and a bit of colour and all the rest of it, right? Have you always seen yourself as a play-by-play caster? I notice when you've listed in interviews, often people look up to, they tend to be the best play-by-play casters, I notice.
So I actually started my career as a analyst, because they already had play-by-play for the very first season of Oceanic Professional League of Legends that Riot was running. That lasted for one season before the guy that I was working with left, and I had to go and quickly find a replacement. I got to thankfully move back to play-by-play at that point. But I've always felt like commentary isn't necessarily that black and white, and I think it's because of my experience with esports commentary in general. I came from StarCraft, right? And I was watching so much of not only Nick and Dan or Tasteless and Artosis, but also like Husky and HD and all sorts of other StarCraft commentators, Zeph and Maynard, like Pig, everyone from back in those. I think Pig was actually playing at that point, but listened to him more recently. But this, like, their style is so much more like you've just got two people having a conversation about a game, and then when something happens, one of them will pick it up. And the way I sort of approached League of Legends was, if you don't know enough about the game, you're never going to be able to ask the right questions anyway. So you need to have someone, even as a play-by-play, that knows what the other guy is going to say so that you can set them up for the correct thing. Because like sometimes I'll ask a dumb question, but that's on purpose.
Yes.
To make sure that like the really smart guy next to me is actually able to tell the viewers the lead up to the other really smart thing that he's going to say. Or he just explains something that's really complicated and we're going to need a little bit of foundation work and things like that. But if I didn't know enough, if I wasn't relatively close to their level, which I'm not saying I am, but you need to be somewhat close in order to get there and to have the good conversations on air, especially in a league like ours where there's a fair bit of downtime. We need to, be able to help each other out when it comes to the analysis. So I've always sort of thought that you need to have a lot of understanding, even if you're not necessarily the smart guy on the show, if that makes sense. I think you're always like a play-by-play needs to be there to leverage the intelligence of the guy next to them and has to be somewhat close in order to make that happen.
I noticed that even though typically the trend in League of Legends, especially if you're not from the LCS or LEC, is it's actually normally, I always tell people with younger casters, like your reputation lags a bit usually in League. Like even if you actually are the best, unless you're literally some rare individual like Gradual, you're not going to get on the Worlds the first year. Like forget about it. Like that'll take a while. You have to like earn your spot and you have to sort of like, you'll get your chance to do like a playing game and then they bring you back. I noticed you got pretty quickly sort of thrown into MSI.
Yeah, I got really lucky though. It was a massive sort of whirlwind at the beginning of that year, like 2015. The transition between 2014 and 2015 was when a lot of commentators were required because that was when esports in League of Legends was booming the hardest, right? Like that was when so much expansion was happening. Like that was the very first year MSI happened. 2 massive tournaments in the 1 year was unprecedented at the time, and so. Spawn and I had been flown out to LA, I believe it was only 6 months prior to MSI starting to do the North American promotion tournament. If you go back and watch that, we're like in Unicorns of Love and we're not very good. I swear we said coming through about 700,000 times. And it still irks me to this day, even though it's something that, often people say and I say it myself. Every time I say it, it like twinges my brain. I'm like, oh God, I said it again. That's the 4 billionth time that I've said it in my career. But we said it so many times during that broadcast. I remember listening back to it and I almost had to turn it off. And I'm a guy that likes the sound of my own voice. So that's a big thing to say. So that was a bit of a rough tournament for us, but I think they recognized that Jake and I had some synergy and they liked what we were bringing to the table. So they, put their faith in us and brought us out for MSI just to add a bit of extra flavor. This was when OPL teams got a run into the wild card as well. We often got a team that made it to events like MSI and Worlds. So they wanted to bring in, some of the more regional talent from first language English regions put on the global broadcast, I guess.
When you did move on to the LPL, like we're talking about, this must have been quite a step up because now, even though people didn't know it, like it wasn't really when in season 8 that the LPL got good because a team won Worlds. They were always really good. Like the level was always very high. And if you watch the top teams, it was obviously famously very competitive. And if people don't know, the other reason why I've always thought it's just time zone and weird broadcast issues that stop people enjoying the LPL, it's also probably the most entertaining league of all time. I mean, it is just action, crazy carries, people doing ego outplays. Like it must be a great league to cut your teeth on at the top level.
Oh, it absolutely is, especially for play-by-plays. I swear, like the amount of fights that you get, right? It's us talking the majority of the time, but also the level of play has always been really high. Like you think back to the very beginning of the LPL, you've got names like Messiah and Wei Zhao and like all of these titans that really put League of Legends on their shoulders. This was back when it was Cloud Templar that was playing Rapid Star, that was playing Nagne, like all of these really, really old names. And the LPL and the LCK, before they even existed as those names, right? That was where all the best players were. This is even when there was only a North American server and they were playing on billions of ping, right? You remember Popstar Ari came out when the Korean servers came out, and that was late
2012, late 2011, maybe late 2011, early 2012.
Like there was like a year and a half. There was a year and a half of Koreans and Chinese players. Yes. Like just smashing the North American server, even if they had to deal with like 200 ping the entire time. So it was always a very impressive thing to see the amount of muscle, like memory, and I guess it's not even necessarily that because they're different keys, but with the fact that these players have been brought up on professional video games for so long, seeing that transition into League of Legends so quickly was pretty mind-boggling, to be perfectly honest, because I was like busy watching the Odd One and Dyrus plot around in the jungle and in the top lane and stuff like that. And then, you know, you see some of these players just come in and completely destroy them. And you're like, what is going on here? Who are these guys? And it was kind of cool seeing this sort of melting pot of a server at the very beginning. But yeah, I think that to go back to the original point, the LPL was certainly alongside the LCK when it came to founding fathers. It's hard to really pin down exactly why the LCK took off so much more. And I think it has to do with the fact that they do a better job humanizing the players. And OGN especially, I think, really helped with their plethora of experience that they'd had, you know, running StarCraft the previous 20 years or something like that.
They know how to make stars,
understanding, right? Yeah, understanding how to put on a show and make these players likable to even a global audience was extraordinarily impressive. Not to mention, you know, DoA and Monty put in a lot of effort when it came to making sure that people knew these players and understood. And then Faker Existing was definitely pretty good too. We've certainly ridden off the back of that one after DoA and Monty left.
By the way, like you said, like when you referenced earlier, that like you guys were trying to get Spawn maybe over to LCK. If people don't know, back then it was a really weird setup because even though LCK was one of the Premier Leagues, obviously the English broadcast to some degree was always like the step kid, basically. It wasn't like you piggyback on the main one. So if people don't know, back then, I know in the years before you came, Monty really did run almost everything. Essentially, it would be him and the producers, and he would tell them like, right, you got to get PapaSmithy, or let's get this guy here. And that's how a lot of people, like, it was one by one, they all sort of got brought over. Did you have a similar story? Because I know you actually, casting-wise, you like just missed Monty. Essentially, you replaced him, sort of, right? So, what was the story? Was there any overlap?
Well, thankfully there was, and it was really nice, to be perfectly honest, because Monty and Susie gave me a bunch of their stuff when I moved in. So I was living with Papa for like the first month or something of my time in Korea, and then Susie helped me get a place. She helped me buy a fridge and stuff like that and get myself in. But then she was like, well, we're leaving, so would you like, you know, this bed and A, B, C, D, all of these different things? And that was absolutely fantastic. But the reason I actually got the gig was exactly like you were talking about, right? Like it was Monty that got people in at the beginning. He got Papa, and then Papa was taking the reins, and he decided that I would be a decent fit. And so we had a conversation. I think it was 2016. When was it? Barcelona. Was that All-Star? I think that was All-Star.
Oh, it makes sense. Yeah,
that we were doing over in Spain, and that was a time for difficult decision making because I had another offer on the table as well, and ultimately decided that Korea would be the right choice. And as it turns out, I have a feeling I made the right call. But you know, you'd never know. You know,
listen, if you want to keep it secret, because he didn't say it there, but the obvious implication is this is LEC or LCS, isn't it? Was it EU LCS?
Yeah, it was. And I don't know whether I should keep that a secret, but it's not a secret.
I don't think it's a problem now. Surely so many years, the statute of limitations surely passed by now. When you say, look, I mean, obviously it was great to do LCK. If people don't know, you've now been the longest tenured caster there. At the same time, though, I'm sure you could have had a lot of fun with LEC, though, right?
No, absolutely. And it was, man, I remember having to think this over for months. It took me a really long time, and I was like almost sure that I was going to go to EU LCS, and then I was sure that I was going to go to Korea, and then I was sure, like both ways I was like absolutely going. But in the end, I ended up talking to a bunch of people that were, you know, living in Germany and living in Korea, and after having a chat to Monty and Papa and DoA and I also spoke to Moonglade and a bunch of the other people that may not have necessarily liked it when they were there. Like Moonglade explained exactly why he left Korea to come back to Australia, because if anyone, I guess this is a name that's extraordinarily old, so I'll give you a little bit of background. Moonglade was an Australian that lived in Korea and casted StarCraft. He was a pro StarCraft and Warcraft 3 player as well. He's also a really great guy. And so I contacted him just to ask him like why I shouldn't go to Korea. And he sort of explained that it wasn't for him because he wanted to be back in a country where everyone spoke English, and he just got homesick, I guess. Didn't really feel like it meshed with him. But part of that conversation actually made me want to go to Korea more, because there are a lot of things that like felt like a challenge or something.
Oh, you wanted it to be different. Right, okay.
Yeah. And all of the things that he explained were negative. I'm like, oh, but that sounds really cool. That sounds really fun. Like, that sounds like a thing that I'd be into. And as it turns out, it was. I think I was here for 2 weeks before I had to call my mom and say, yeah, no, that 2-year deal that I was thinking about going with, we're going to have to extend that. I'm sorry. Because I decided that I kind of wanted to stay there forever. And we got pretty strong. It's like, what, 6-7 years now? And my wife's here, and we've got 2 cats. So it's going to be difficult to uproot at this point in time.
I mean, one of the things we can obviously do in this interview is you don't have to go chronologically. So I'll skip forwards. The question I was going to ask you, but it's the perfect segue, is this is something I actually realized when I was like doing research to do that video that I did, which is, dude, this even crept up on me. In my mind, right, Monty casted like Korean League of Legends for 30 years, you know, and like, but then when I looked it up, dude, you've actually casted more years than him now. You've even done more than PapaSmithy. You are actually the longest tenured figure on the OGN/LCK broadcast now. Like, I think you've got him by a couple of years as well, mate. So in theory, the LCK is Atlus now. That's kind of crazy to think about, right?
That's mind-boggling. I don't want to take that mantle. I'm not ready. I am absolutely not ready. Surely Papa's got like he did like the entire 2018 year, right?
Oh, does it? His should get an account for more, right? Okay.
So that should count for like 2 years at least. So I'm not ready to pick up that mantle. But it's actually it's kind of crazy. I was thinking about it as well. I think I've casted the most hours of League of Legends in English than any other person on the planet professionally.
I think that's totally plausible, because if you think about it, right, a lot of people obviously cycle out of the big gigs like LCK and LPL because it is a lot of work. And then also those 2 leagues, as you referenced with the LPL earlier, the amount of raw games that you have to catch is incredible. I mean, obviously LCK, everything's the best of 3. So if you ran the numbers, you probably are number 1.
Yeah, and I remember I tweeted about it. This was like a year or 2 ago. And Freak was like, no, I think that can't be. Hang on a second. No, yeah, you're probably right.
No, he's forgetting there's too many seasons he did that with the BO1s, just like 18 of them all. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about it, and like the added up hours must be like an extraordinarily ridiculous number that I just prefer not to think about. I'm just focusing on 2024 LCK, and we'll see how that goes, you know?
Even if you don't want to take that mantle, doesn't the LCK, it must feel sort of like you're stomping grounds. It's your place, right? It's yours.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, like, as soon as I got there, it kind of felt like that anyway. Not necessarily like it was mine, like I owned it, but I felt like I belonged there, if that makes sense. Because like I had been working with Chris for so long, and everyone over there was so incredibly welcoming that I really did kind of feel like I was already part of the gang when we first started casting. And thankfully, because I did all of my work at the beginning with Papa, because this was when it was the OGN SPO TV split.
Yes.
If you remember. So I would be casting with Papa purely, and then it would be, I think the very first, it was
I think it was LS,
Brendan and LS.
Yeah, I think so.
Might have been something else earlier on, but the SPO TV broadcast we had nothing to do with, so I would be doing the days that Achilleos didn't do, and Papa would be with the 2 of us working every single day at that point in time. So this was before the merger and the LCK-ifying that happened in 2019. So yeah, it was good to be able to, you know, just go back into something that was very familiar. And I think Papa did a lot of carrying at the very beginning, and then once he sort of had got us all set up, we were pretty good to go moving forward when he decided that he wanted to go into more administrative roles and find himself in North America and leave us all on our own and all that stuff.
Like I say, the other thing as well is this just shows when you've been around long enough, as well as it feels like Monty was there forever. Then it feels like the joke is it feels like PapaSmithy left 5 minutes ago. In reality, he left more like 5 years ago. It was quite a long time ago now. So bear in mind, there will be a lot of people watching this interview now, Atlus, might have never heard PapaSmithy commentate a League of Legends game, potentially, definitely not the LCK. So can you give them some insight? Who is he as a person and who is he as a commentator? Because you've obviously worked with him so much.
Well, I mean, Papa was a pro player many years ago. About 10 years ago, I was playing WCG events and stuff like that for a team, I believe, that was called Mind Freak at the time in the Oceanic scene. But he also, started off with Pastry Time. Him and Pastry were the commentators in Australia. They were the guys. They were, what was it, Stars War League or something, the LPL broadcast that they would do. That was sort of their baby. And that was a lot of Korean players playing in that as well. But it was mainly Chinese players. And that was where I sort of saw them for the first time. I saw them live at PAX Australia in 2013, middle of the year, something like that. And they were legends. And I was sort of like standing and like huddled in the back, like trying to watch this show. And I was like, oh, there are those famous people sitting up there, and look at how cool that is and all that sort of stuff. But I'd also, because I had a few connections in the early league scene in Australia, I'd found my way to like having, a few chats here and there with Chris. We played a few games here and there and things like that. I was terrible. So that was sort of, carrying me through and things like this. I just never really had the hands for it, to be perfectly honest. But I'm a good person to have on Discord. So they liked me for that. So I got to like hang out and play a few games and things like that. And eventually, met him, and, we casted together in 2013 at the end of the year. This is when he told me to, just chill out and stop being a jerk. But that was because we'd established ourselves a bit of a friendship at that point in time. And we went through the entirety of the LPL. And the LPL is kind of like going to war, like you're in the trenches together, and that really steals a friendship. And him and Pastry still casted together, but I got to work with him as well in that time in 2015. That was brilliant. 2016 rolls around. That was when I believe Papa left, and I stayed and did that year in the LPL. And then I joined him like a year later. It's actually kind of nutty now that you mention it, right? Like, because you were talking about the fact that like the difference in time is, it felt to me like when I got there that Chris had been there for ages.
Yes.
But it's just the early years of esports feel so condensed, like extremely condensed, when now we've been going for 10 years, but those first 4, that was where all of the new things were happening. That feels like it lasted for an extraordinarily long time. So I think that's why it's all a bit warped, because that was the first time I've thought about the fact that it was only 1 year that Chris was there before I arrived. So it's kind of nutty. But Chris then, he casted 2 world finals. The guy he was a machine. 2018 was the year of PapaSmithy. If you know who he is, that's because you probably listened to him cast every single LCK game for an entire year. And that's just the kind of guy he was. He was super dedicated. He was also, I think, doing some co-streaming, or at least VOD reviewing of the LEC during the same time. Like, it was absurd, the amount of hours that guy put in, and also often came out with this as well. So he'd managed to do it all. Have no idea how he had so much time. I also think that year he started going to the gym and lost like 25 kilos. So I don't know. The guy's a machine.
A person who actually, I'll have to set up the context. I feel like people won't recognize him when I describe him now. If I say now LS, everyone knows him as a giant core stream. He literally makes millions of dollars a year. He essentially can do anything he wants in esports. He can kind of have the run of the table. And I would say in his own way, he's almost like part of the furniture of League of Legends now. Everyone accepts him. Even if people don't like him now, they sort of begrudgingly allow him his space. They don't hate on him, right? But dude, do you remember when he was doing the commentary back in the days you're talking about? And especially when you combined the broadcasts, it was you and him. That was when, if people don't know, even as an analyst and a content creator, he was very controversial and divisive at the time, actually. A lot of people didn't like him, or they thought, like, even though now they sort of credit him as sort of a sage figure, back then they thought he was pretentious, and he's just coming up with these crazy ideas. And so one of the things I've always credited you for, actually, is I do think you were a very good foil for him as a commentator. Because at the time, I was friends with him. I'd known him a long time. But I used to even tell him privately, dude, like, look, do the YouTube videos, but like, I don't have commentaries for you, mate. Like, it's live, it's impromptu. You haven't got time to sit down and do a 20-minute digression about Dragon Ball Z and how it relates to like fakers playing a zero or something. But I thought you did a very good job sort of humanizing him and making it like a fun, you sort of counterbalanced how intense he is. And I felt like you are part of the reason why people started to accept him. I think you made him palatable, as it were.
I think like LS, because he started casting with Valdes, I believe.
I think so, yeah.
Over at Spo TV in 2017. We also spent a little bit of time together in LA when we went over for Worlds, because Worlds was in China and they did the first bit remote. I believe that was 2017. It's really, really hard. All of the years have kind of meshed together. But there was a time where we spent a bit of time together over there. He got a bit sick over there, if I remember correctly.
If you know LS, you get sick everywhere. But yeah, fair enough.
Well, that's true. He is a professional hypochondriac.
Yes.
But he was someone that I'd sort of seen around for quite a bit. As someone that never leaves his house, like seeing him around quite a bit means, at work things and stuff like that, that we had been to together in the past. So thankfully, like when I first met him, he was already somewhat practiced and he knew me relatively well as well. So because we had that, it was actually, I think, to my advantage when it came to trying to work out how to cast with him. And I casted with so many different people as well. Like we were having the conversation about the LPL. That meant that I was casting with 4 or 5 different color commentators. Over at MSI, I got thrown with absolutely everyone. Every year after that was completely different co-casters. So learning different people's ticks and the things that are universal and the things that aren't, right, was something that I had actually had a fair bit of practice with. And so I just had to sort of get into the the LS gear in order to work with him. And he's got such a huge brain that it's actually very, very easy. You just need to do what I was talking about and set up some foundation so that he can just, build the house. And he does it extraordinarily well. When LS is talking about something that he's confident talking about, be that obscure pop culture references, Magic the Gathering, or very high level League of Legends, he will just go. And so I just wind him up and he'd go. And then I just hard interrupt him if there was any action that happened. And I did that in, the most, courteous way possible. And that was sort of how it worked. And it worked really, really well. It got to the point where, coming to work and working with LS was as easy as working with Papa, which was not something, it's not something that I say lightly, right? Like Burn Spawn, I think will always be the casters that made me into the guy that I am today. And they will always be the ones that were easiest to work with. But man, like LS really got close. And that's, like you mentioned, he's not a natural when it comes to commentary, but I think that he really found his niche and just carved it out for himself. He was like, no, I'm not going to change. You're going to accept that this is how I do this job and you're going to enjoy it. And people did. So it worked out in the end. It was me and it was Valdes that were able to do it as well. Valdes also, I think, started playing Magic with him.
Oh, right.
In order to, help start things. He was method acting real hard. No, he wasn't. He actually just really enjoys those sorts of games. But that wasn't quite as much for me. So they went off and did that a bit together. I think, they really started a friendship during their time at Spo TV, and that carried forward to the LCK as well. And I got lucky also because we started the POG state, LS and I. So
this is something I want to ask you about.
A bunch of other stuff that we were talking about as well.
So the reason I actually do want to ask you specifically about the podcast you're talking about, the POG state, is, to me, dude, this is actually when the LCK got a new identity, because before it really was, like I said before, it was like Monte and Doa, and then it was like there's a Papa era, and then once Papa leaves and it's just you and LS and Val, it could have really just gone to pot then. Like without being insulting, they know all of them. The reason why, one of the reasons the LPL isn't universally loved isn't that the games aren't great. It's that it's a lot of newer talent. It doesn't really have a coherent identity. And like you say, they cycle so many casters and there's 8 or 9 people. I thought actually what the POG state did was it kind of laid a foundation for the narratives and for humorous elements and getting to know little details about the players. I think actually that really did sort of revivify the LCK for me. So you played quite a pivotal role in that, right?
Well, yeah. It was kind of my baby off the back of something that Papa was pushing for many years. We would not have a podcast without Papa, but after he left was when we finally got the resources to actually be able to make it happen. And I was like, well, there's no way we're not trying to make sure that we actually make this work, because otherwise, like the memory of PapaSmithy is, is going to be very upset at me. And the real one probably would too. So we really pushed very hard to make that happen. And I was having a lot of conversations with, I think, Yeowon at the time, who was our producer. We've gone through a few of them until we got to Jisun, but the Yeowon era was a fantastic one for us. She helped import a lot of really great talent. She helped us find Chronicler and helped us get Wolf in as well and things like this.
Right.
So there are a lot of things that she really helped out with, and one of them was the podcast. And she also got us hooked up with two guys that were working for Netflix at the time that were producing the podcast for us. Yeah, and so we had a guy that was producing, and then an editor as well who was also working on similar projects. And the two of them really, like, I don't know, I hadn't really been used to edited content before because I'd been like a live yeller into a microphone for a really long time. And so to see what they managed to do, even with the very first episode, was like pretty impressive, in my opinion, because we didn't have like, there weren't crazy amounts of scripts, and you can't really script LS just in general.
Sure.
So that was always really difficult to do. So we just had to see where it goes. And then Ian, who was our editor, would put it into something that made some sense. And we ended up having a whole heap of fun with some crazy stuff. Like we did an LS house tour and all sorts of stuff in the first few years that was really fun. We also got Jisun to come in and play duo lanes, like weird duo lanes that other pros had been playing at the time, to try and work out whether they're good. And she'd play them with Kisun, who is one of our observers who lived in England for a really long time. So is this dude that is Korean, but will sit with us at our table and speak in this perfectly posh British accent when we're having lunch together.
That must be a mindfuck.
It's fantastic. I love him. It's brilliant. But they would sit down in lab coats and like test out these bottom lanes, and that was just like one of our little segments that we'd have and stuff like that on the podcast. We had a lot of fun with it. And when in its current form now was after a lot of iterations and things like that, and doing our like ads for merch for the LCK and stuff like that. Like that's all Ian and his incredible editing skills. He did an ad for Chronicler's Challenger co-stream, which is the dumbest thing that you'll ever see in your life, and it's absolutely fantastic. He got me to record voiceover just doing like that epic the epic trailers guy voice. And he just gave me a script and said, read that, I'm going to do something with it. And I was like, all right, we'll just see how this goes. And it turned out hilarious. So I think a lot of it comes down to those two and James and Ian, the producer and the editor. It's now just Ian. He just does the editing, but we've got a few behind the scenes that are helping out with that one as well. But I think the LCK has always been a league that has a family of commentators. And I think that that's been the identity since it was Monte-DoA, right? Because there's always been a commentary family in Korea. And that includes all of the games, and everyone's sort of involved in this. And I think having that sort of environment, that sort of atmosphere has really helped us cultivate what the feeling of the LCK is and have it last throughout lots of different people.
It's also what keeps people there.
There's a million other people,
Isn't it true as well? Because I had a similar experience when I lived there. If there'd have been no Monte-DoA and no one else, maybe I'd have gone for a few months or I'd fun for six. But like the fact that, like you say, there's a mini community, and because actually you are all foreigners and they're all Koreans, if people don't know, Koreans very much do stick to themselves. You almost need people like that. It's what keeps you going, right? It's like your outpost there of the Anglosphere or whatever, I don't know, but like it does. I imagine you wouldn't have stayed as long without those people, right? If you'd just already been doing the job on its own.
No, absolutely. I think if it wasn't for Wolf and Tasteless, I would not have been as sure about staying in Korea as I am, and of course meeting my wife as well. But I was pretty sure before I even met her, which was a year after. Having that sort of community vibe that we had going on, like it was the point where we were meeting 5 days a week, and we'd just be hanging out, and we'd finish work and we'd go and meet at the bar, and we'd like send in a little group chat, like we're heading over here, and everyone sort of turns up and we sit down together and let off some steam at the end of the day and then wake up and do it all again, is kind of how it worked out. And thankfully in Korea, everything's open forever. And so
yes.
our schedule of going to sleep at 4 a.m. and waking up in time for work sort of worked out very, very well in the early days. Not so good now as I'm getting older, not going to lie, but it was definitely pretty handy to be able to order fried chicken when you get home at 5 a.m.
I feel like to explain Wolf to League fans, I have to assume they just don't know anything outside of League. So if people don't know, like even way back in the day when I first went to see Monty, I'm talking like 10 years ago in Korea, as you're talking about, Wolf was around then. He was a StarCraft 2 commentator and he was a very social figure, actually. Like I remember he even took me to some club or something, even though I was there mainly for League of Legends, obviously. If people don't know, what's weird is when you described all the commentators before you used to listen to in StarCraft 2, that's also Wolf's era. That's when he was doing, obviously, the Pro League and stuff in Korea. And so I always knew... Yes, true. Valdes there all the time. When I heard he was going to come to League, though, I have to say I was a little bit like, it wasn't that I was skeptical, but I was more like, ooh, how will they play this, though? Because the thing is, if you've ever seen Wolf on a StarCraft broadcast, he basically is the expert. Like, he's always the guy who knows everything about the players. He's watched a million games. He knows what they're doing on the ladder and what their secret builds are, and he's read the interview. So I actually wondered, like, fuck, he's coming in a bit late to League, isn't he? Like, holy shit, like, I know he's followed it a little bit, but essentially, if he's going to make that persona, it's going to be a hard sell. And I will say, by the way, unlike the LS example, I don't know that yet that he's fully got over the line. He hasn't been put over fully in the wrestling terminology yet. Like, I feel like he's still in the middle because some people do try to flame him. If they don't know him outside of League, they think he is just a Johnny come lately who came the last few years and he's trying to be the expert. So what's it been like to work with him? I'm sure that's a different challenge, right? Because on the one hand, he's clearly got like a mind for games. It's fantastic. Think how many games he's done. But like I say, he was pretty fresh when he came to you.
No, absolutely. It was difficult at the very beginning because also it was kind of thrust upon him as well. He made the transition from Overwatch at the time where he was absolutely beloved. Him and Achilles in Overwatch League were, one of the most popular duos. Interestingly enough, after Thorin and Monty left, which just seems to be a thing.
Yes.
But yeah, him coming into League was something I knew was going to be a long-term move. Right. Because I know that like Wolf is a phenomenal broadcaster. And often you see people come into League of Legends from a professional player or some other personality within the scene and then turn commentator from that point, right? So they already have like this established knowledge base, but we hadn't seen someone really make a successful move to the highest level as a broadcaster instead of as like a professional elsewhere. So it was always going to be difficult. I think it's still the one thing that was really tough at the beginning was the fact that the knowledge difference between play-by-play and color is a bit off, right? Like it's not I'm not supposed to know more than my co-caster, right? But at the beginning, it was definitely that. And now I don't know whether it necessarily is. I think like Wolf has got an amazing brain for not only just the game, but also he just stores knowledge. So he just knows a lot of things. Like now that he's been casting for so long, and like we're coming up on year 4 and stuff like that. Like it's kind of mind blowing, but he just keeps things in his brain, and so he'll now know more things about the players because he remembers it better than I do.
Right.
And so he now has that bedrock of knowledge. And the thing that's been difficult for me, and I've had to make this transition this year, has been like loosening the reins. Right, like not trying to make sure that I'm there to catch him if he says something that isn't necessarily correct, because I need to be like, oh no, he knows and he's going to explain, instead of me having to be like, oh yeah, but like, of course, this, in order to try and theoretically save a situation. That's not my job anymore because he knows plenty. And I think that like you mentioned the fact that, there were people that were somewhat vocal about his ability to cast the LCK. That has severely died off, especially this year.
Great.
So it's been much better, and I knew that it was going to work out. Just knew that it was going to be a rocky path to get there, and thankfully, like we've really started to hit some solid ground. And he's put in an incredible amount of work, like a ridiculous amount. And like he's been doing his show with Monty and stuff like that, like where the two of them talk about League together and things like this. He was also like Papa's best friend the entire time he was in Korea. So it's not like he's been exposed to League of Legends since it began, right? This guy has been obsessed with esports. He's been a professional StarCraft, Heroes of the Storm, Overwatch, and now League of Legends commentator at the highest level. So I think that like there was always going to be that time where it was going to be difficult, but I think like seeing the light at the end of the tunnel was never all that hard, especially for those of us that were working with him.
Since you've referenced Valdes so many times, I'll give the setup for that if people don't know. So what's interesting about his setup is he actually, in theory, is the longest tenured Korean caster in League of Legends because he was there even before Monty. He was in like the first ever ones. And in fact, at the time, it actually makes more sense that at the time, it wasn't that he was like big in League. Obviously, League had just begun in Korea. He was from StarCraft as well. And if people don't know, back then, the vibe was, like you're talking about the little group of like English-speaking people. If you're just in that group and you're in Korea, this is where actually people don't really know the game. It's like, if you really want to get on the LCK, you don't go on a different broadcast and hope you get invited. Go and do a different game in Korea and get to know the producers. They might actually give you the next gig when they need like one person to fill in. And basically that's what Valdes got. He got like the initial OGN gig when Champions began, etc. And so a lot of people, I think, actually don't know how long tenured he is and that he did StarCraft before. And also, because I was there in Korea, I've spoken to this guy quite a lot. He's one of the people who, I don't know if people know this on the broadcast, he has some of the best Korean, like conversational Korean of almost anyone there as far as I know, because he actually did that thing where you go to like a real school every day for hours and hours to learn, and obviously had girlfriends and stuff. As far as I know, he's actually essentially, it's weird because on the broadcast I feel like he gets put as just the everyman, but he's a lot more tenured than people realize. Give me some insight into this guy from your working experience.
It's actually really interesting because Valdes is a very soft-spoken guy. He will not like come out and tell you his story. You have to really poke him and prod him to get there. That is true for his Korean as well. So he's like stealth.
Oh, he hides it, even though he's actually really good. Like when I was there, dude, he was having whole conversations with people. It was very impressive, yeah.
No. He absolutely can, but he doesn't if he doesn't have to.
Right.
He will only like he uses it with his wife. Him and his wife have like these weird like double conversations where she'll just talk to him in Korean and he'll just answer in English, but he perfectly understands everything that she's saying and all this sort of stuff. And he's been there for 12 years. After he came over because of like some Azubu invitation that he managed to win or something like that, and then casted with Mole Trap and Double Lift. The very first like 2012, I believe that was Azubu Frost versus oh god, what was the EU team's name?
Oh, CLGEU.
CLGEU, that was the one. And I remember watching that live and having no idea who he was and not really paying attention to it. I knew who Doublelift was, of course, because, you know, he was all big famous and stuff like that, but I had no idea who Valdes was and who Mole Trap was. And then to realize that it was him, like all these years later when I meet him, I'm like, holy crap, he has been around the traps for an extraordinarily long time. And it's interesting because the entire time it was like the Monte-DoA era. I believe he was also working with Spo TV on those couple of days that were always bookending the OGN days as well. So he's just always sort of stealth been there as the guy. But he is just, you know, pretty understated. He's just happy to go and work and do the stuff. I think he's extraordinarily talented as well. He doesn't have, I don't know. Ego is completely missing from a lot of what Valdes does. You know, for better or worse. I think it makes him an amazing friend, but I think that it hasn't done him a lot of favors when it comes to making sure that he can get more and more work and putting himself out there and things like that. So it can be a double-edged sword, but it certainly makes him a great friend.
I know in League of Legends, partly by nature of how many games there are, but it also seems to be the Riot approach to how they hire and put people together. There actually aren't many duos nowadays. Like the whole Monte-DoA thing is a long time ago now. And obviously in your career, you're just one of the few mainstays. People have cycled around you. Some people were there before. Some people have since gone. You've got new people. Have you ever wanted to have a duo? Have you ever had someone where you thought this is going to be a duo?
I've had multiple. Yeah. Well, me and Spawn at the very beginning, we were the duo back in the OPL. They would put us on the majority of the OPL casts, and then we'd be casting with everybody else when it came to the LPL and things like that. That sort of meshed together. But the entirety of 2014, it was just Jake and I working together. We'd do a lot of the international broadcasts together as well. And then when I came to Korea, it was obviously Papa, and that was sort of the one. And then 2019, I think like 2020, LS and I really sort of like started to hit our stride. I think, you know, Chronicler has made leaps and bounds as well, and people have really enjoyed us casting together. And Wolf and I have had a dynamic for years. When we cast Overwatch together, when we were both working for OGN, And he needed to give me another one of those PapaSmithy moments when I got a little bit ahead of myself in Overwatch. I was the guy that did the beautiful tracking thing when Soldier 76 gets auto aim. It was one of those moments where I really needed to be a little.
That's a pretty funny mistake to make, though. I have to say that's pretty good.
But I will stand by the fact that if it hadn't have been with his ultimate, he still would have killed those people. Okay, Thorin?
Right.
He still would have killed those people. And the reason I got completely reamed for it is because Taimu, the guy that was actually playing Soldier 76 at the time, went back and reviewed it.
He's a bit spicy as well, if people don't know.
Losing his mind. So at least, I'm one of the biggest memes in Overwatch, especially at the very beginning. But it was not exactly my finest hour, one could say. But, Wolf and I have been really good friends ever since I arrived in Korea. So it's been really nice to be able to jump back into that dynamic again. Even if it was a little bit of a struggle when it came to knowledge, he makes up for that with the fact that we've got years and years of talking to each other, right? And so I just know how he works. And so that makes things very, very easy. We're really lucky, though, when it comes to the LCK, because we don't need to have static duos, because I feel like at the moment, and even with the addition of Dan, like we're just a team of dudes that like working with each other. And I think you can plug and play. And I want to step away a little bit from duos and more just like we're the casting team that is now running the LCK. And with, lore involved as well, like the team is only growing bigger and bigger. And I'm looking forward to where that ends up, because I don't think it is really about duos necessarily. It's more about like how many people can we have like pick up the LCK mantle so that we can all like expand it together is kind of my theory.
One of the reasons when I asked about the 2015 MSI, when you were working with the OPL and set it up that way, is because essentially, even though on that one, you did get the early call up, but you notice by your answer, it was through the door of the OPL. It wasn't just, here's the best caster in the world, let's invite him. When you then went to the LCK, though, then you had to put in the years, like I described. Like it took, I noticed you would get like a Rift Rivals invite, like, oh, you're at Worlds, but join the Plains. Or, oh, you're at one, you get some group stage game. It took you years to get to the playoffs, mate. The funny thing is, though, once you did, though, then you like went right to the finals. But what are these years like? Because here's the problem. I understand no one ever wants to be ungrateful. Like one of the hardest things about esports is, on the one hand, you're part of a team when you work on a broadcast, and they're all your friends who are your co-partners, etc. Right? But they are also your competition. So on the one hand, you want to work the event, but you don't also want to be like, hey, I'm the best, hire me, because it just feels a bit fucked up. Doesn't it? You want everyone else to tell you that you should be hired and just to get the call up. So I know in League, people very rarely ever come out and publicly say like I was disappointed or whatever. They always do that thing, which probably is the best approach. You just have gratitude when you do get the gig, basically, and you wait your time. But if you've been doing the best league in the world for many, many years, and let's be real, even if this was when the LPL was winning Worlds, like Korea is extremely relevant to Worlds. Like the playoffs essentially is Korean and Chinese teams. Like in these years when you're putting in, like, is it hard to sort of wait for your name to be called or to get, or if you go to just, like one thing I know from Counter-Strike, dude, is I used to always feel really bad for the guys who would get brought in for the group stage, like the sort of like one of the bottom of the totem pole, and then they get sent home and we do the playoffs. Like they're on a plane while we're starting like the big quarterfinal match, like that sort of sucks too, right? When you go there and then you don't get to do the big matches. Give me some thoughts on this, because obviously you're there now, you're getting the call-ups now. So what did you think over those years?
Well, it's interesting because I sort of knew that I was making a transition into, more difficult waters when it came to international events when I moved to Korea. What a lot of people don't really know is that I was actually like a red badge rioter in Australia. Yeah. And so I did my D-Noob over in LA in 2014. This was after doing the other gig, but I was like a full-time employee in the Sydney office until I believe it was like 2016 or something like that, where they, there was a big transition to, commentators. It doesn't make sense for them to be full-time. Like we should probably make this a freelance gig and work our contracts differently and things like that. But up until then, I was full time. And so it was very easy. And I also had so many connections, right? Because there were like, I was working within a Riot office. I was part of the Riot ecosystem. I could access all of like the Riot Slack channels and blah, 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 all of this stuff year round it's completely blocked off once you like leave the company or leave affiliation with that. And moving to OGN was exactly what did that, right? And so instead of it being very, very easy for them to be like, we'll contact the Oceanic office and just see who wants to come. And then I'll have a conversation with someone and then it'll be worked out. Like, it was often a package deal that would be worked out with the amount of people that were in our office that were commentators at the time, because we were doing the LPL and everyone was here. It was very easy to just ship us all over and, we'll come to 2015 Worlds and, travel around and do all that sort of stuff. So I did know that it was going to be a more difficult thing transitioning. And I was freelance before I left as well and still went to Worlds and still did all that stuff. It's not like, oh, I'm not a fledged writer, now I'm not getting any gigs or anything like that. That's not how it worked. But I think like being out of sight, it's a bit of the out of sight, out of mind thing, right? Like, I don't have like Daniel Ringland, who was my manager at the time. I don't have him there to advocate for me. I am instead dealing with a lot of people working at OGN, and then Riot Korea was this other entity that was, somewhere completely different at the time. So we're working for a broadcast company that is then buying the rights to broadcast this game from another company that doesn't have an affiliation. So that's why I think it was a little bit more difficult. I did have all of my connections and I was talking to people about how to do it and things like this. And there were other people from Korea that were getting work. Obviously, Monty has been on World's broadcast many, many times until he wasn't, right? So it was something that was possible, but my avenues to get in weren't there. And I also think that I needed to cut my teeth a little bit as an LCK commentator before I could represent that region properly, I think. So when I didn't get a spot in MSI 2017, I think that made sense because I didn't work. Like, I didn't get to career until March. So that was when most of the season was finished, right? So it made sense to not get there. And then I was on every other World's broadcast. I just wasn't, doing the final or doing the quarterfinals or things like that. I was always there. Just people kind of forget because I was there for things like play-ins and stuff like that. And I loved play-ins. I was the guy that, like, we always used to cast the international wildcard tournament, all of the things that were leading up to all of the qualifiers for Worlds and for MSI. We did them because we had all the commentators. I remember we first met Valdes was when he was shipped over to Sydney in order to help us out, casting some of the IWs, like the wildcard tournament stuff. So like that was always kind of my bag, and I knew a bunch of these players and things like this, so it was always very, very easy. I didn't have to do as much research every year because, I mean, I knew what all of these guys looked like. I'd been casting Seros, playing Heimerdinger mid forever, so it was very, very easy to just, jump back in. And it was nostalgic as well. I actually loved it. So being on those broadcasts was actually absolutely fine, and it was a whole lot of fun. And when it comes to like having to give up the biggest gigs and things like this, it's never really been that difficult. I'm just kind of the guy that's always pretty keen to be there in general. And when I've got people that are saying like, oh, I wish you were doing this final, I actually kind of feel uncomfortable, to be perfectly honest, because I look to guys like Medic and Flowers and even Valdes and everyone that's come before, right? Like Doa and Freak and Rivington, like these are guys that I've looked up to my entire career. And so I'm pretty happy to see that they're still going strong, because what I'd like is to be able to do this for 50 years. So if they're still doing it and they're still doing well, then I'm going to be fine. So no more retiring like Freak, please. Like, we need Flowers to stick around so him and I can just be here forever. That's my theory.
When I make content, it isn't just me, the mic, and a guest or a topic. It's also me with the support of my whole crew. Who's that, you might ask? The Skrilluminati. That's who. They include Frisky, Matt Pugnaccio Racula, Ahmed Hadju, Tosh, Tobias Bernasconi, Jensen Gore, Animosity, Toucan, and you know it if you've heard it before, but if you haven't, a special thanks goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Well, if you want to know upcoming topics and guests I'm going to have on my channel, maybe you want to ask me a question to answer in an AMA in video fashion. Do you want to hear one of those long discussions and actually be part of it and be able to ask me questions? Want to find out who I'm going to interview next? If any of these perks or more appeal to you, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Skrilluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.